phone. You probably have one, or as Mr. Wyatt Cheng would say,
Do you guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
You can play on your tablet too.
But let's talk about Canonical. Nowadays, they mainly focus on the server side, whilst also keeping a strong desktop offering with Ubuntu Desktop. But back in the early 2010s, they had much, much wider goals, and all of this stemmed from what was known as the Unity Desktop, a desktop that came directly out of Canonical. Nowadays, Unity does still exist and has some third-party development and does exist as an Ubuntu flavor, but back then, it was shipped as the main Ubuntu desktop. But why does Unity matter? Unity wasn't just a random name picked out of the ether. It did relate directly to what they were doing. They were looking into a concept known as convergence, where basically you would run the same operating system across all of your devices, and preferably you'd be able to dock a device into various different form factors and then use that device to power that system. So obviously you had things like Ubuntu Desktop. They were also looking into Ubuntu TV, Ubuntu tablets, and of course, Ubuntu phones, which is our focus for today. Now, Ubuntu TV was never actually a thing that materialized. They did have software for it, but when it came to the hardware integration, all of the demos they showed were just desktop PCs running under a table connected with an HDMI cord. But with the Ubuntu mobile offerings, those did materialize and are something that are still being developed today. You might know this as Ubuntu Touch, developed under the UbiPorts organization. But were you aware that prior to becoming an operating system that could be installed on just regular other mobile devices like your Fairphone or Pixel, Ubuntu Touch was actually being developed for an official Canonical branded, Ubuntu branded phone? And no, I don't mean a rebadge where they just buy a bunch of OEM phones and slap their name on it. It's like, ooh, look, Ubuntu phone. No, I mean an actual phone developed in-house by Canonical, manufactured specifically for Ubuntu Touch. That phone was called the Ubuntu Edge phone, and the renders of it look pretty damn cool. I don't know how it would feel to hold. Like, there's a reason why most phones now have very clearly rounded edges. That, whilst they are rounded at a point, so it probably would start digging into your hand fairly quickly. Now, the Edge is not something they just tried to fund by themselves. They looked to the community and tried to do some crowdfunding over on Indiegogo. Now, you might ask, how much funding were they looking for? $32 million. Now, in the era of things like Star Citizen continuing to raise money, I think the numbers are like 700 million, and the countless crypto scam projects back in the 2020s that had nonsense amounts of funding, 32 million in the grand scheme of things now, whilst being a lot of money, isn't a lot of money in the context of just how ridiculous crowdfunding projects did get. But this wasn't a recent project. This was on July 22nd, 2013. And back then, it was a ludicrous amount of money that, if it actually succeeded, would have easily set records. For context, this was not that long after the Pebble smartwatch Kickstarter, which made a bit over $10 million, and that was considered a giant success of the time, and the Pebble was a really cool device. So something came along just a few months later that not only did a little bit better than the Pebble, but tripled the amount that they made on their crowdfunding attempt. Everybody would have been talking about that. And initially, it seemed like it was going really well. 5 hours in, the first $1 million passed. Just a few hours later, $2 million, and less than 2 days in, $3.5 million. Obviously, it was slowing down, but there was still a lot of excitement around this device. There was still a lot of people talking about it. There was a lot of news coming out about it. There was a lot of people doing interviews, and they were really trying to make this a thing that actually succeeded. And by the end, it did end up passing the Pebble in funding. But as you could probably guess from the lack of Ubuntu Edge phones out there, the lack of people selling them secondhand, the lack of knowing someone who knows someone who knows someone who has an Ubuntu Edge phone in their closet, it didn't end up reaching its goal. So instead of being remembered as the greatest success of the time, it's instead remembered as what might be the greatest miss of the time. With 27,633 backers, which is really impressive, they raised $12,733,521 US. This was 39% of their 32 million goal. And keep in mind, this was a fixed goal. This meant that if they didn't meet the 32 million, they didn't get any of this. This meant that Indiegogo had to refund $12.7 million. Now, this was such a miss and so important for Indiegogo at the time that a few years later, Canonical actually wrote a blog post about the Ubuntu Edge phone, how the campaign was handled, how the platform has changed since then, and how large campaigns like this could be better handled in the future to make sure that this preferably doesn't happen again. Clearly, it didn't succeed, but by raising $12.7 million across 27,500 people, it clearly shows there was a lot of interest in actually making this phone and making this a thing that you could actually use. So besides it just being a Linux phone, what was so great about this device that so many people were willing to part with their money? The specs of this device were out of this world, and I mean this in the most literal sense possible. They did not make any sense. Firstly, because this was going to be such a low sale volume device. This device was not going to be generally retail available. It was only for sale through the Indiegogo campaign. Secondly, they were not specs for a phone in 2013, so this was being compared with the iPhone 5 and the Galaxy S4, just to put it into context of the top devices of the time. Also, it wasn't just Ubuntu, it was going to dual boot Android and Ubuntu Mobile, which is cool, I guess, along with having a desktop OS, that being Ubuntu Desktop. This goes into the convergence thing where you could dock it to a monitor and then use it as your PC. Now, to do this, it was going to need to have PC specs. It had 4 gigabytes of RAM. This was compared to the iPhone's 1 gigabyte and the S4's 2 gigabytes. Already off to a great start. Internal storage, 128 gigabytes compared to the iPhone 64 and the Galaxy S4's 16. Now, the resolution is one of the few things which wasn't crazy. A 720p screen at 4.5 inches, which is a slightly higher resolution than what the iPhone had at 4 inches, and slightly less than the S4 at 1080p with 5 inches. This is a completely normal display of the time. This is less normal. For the screen, Gorilla Glass was not good enough, so instead, let's use Sapphire Glass, which at the time was about 10x the production cost, because, look, if we're doing this already, might as well throw some Sapphire Glass in as well. For good measure, let's do dual LTE instead of regular LTE, and have stereo speakers, which honestly is how every single phone should be anyway, and let's do all of this... Let's do all of this at a cheaper cost than the S4 and the iPhone. Now here it says CPU and GPU to be finalized before production. It doesn't specify exactly what they are using here. However, we do have a hint of what it was going to have. They say fastest multi-core CPU. So it was going to have whatever the top of the line at the time was, which is probably just what was in the S4. Or maybe, depending on when it released, what the S5 had. And no, we are not cutting corners by having a plastic body. This was going to be crafted from cool, textured, amorphous metal. The Edge has a distinctive, precise look, but its rakishly chamfered edges are shaped to fit naturally in the palm. I hate how pretentious this is being written, but the point there is a full metal body. Oh, did I forget that along the edge, there was going to be gesture controls as well? Now, there's a very important concept when it comes to buying things and making things. The more that you buy, the cheaper the things become. And they're not gonna be buying at the scale of Samsung or the scale of Apple. So these devices naturally are going to cost a lot more to produce. I assume if they got the funding, they were certainly gonna try to make it. But I don't know if they ever would have delivered anything. Maybe if they had funded everything, Mark Shuttleworth would have just ate the cost and just made it happen, but there have been way more successful campaigns than this with way less ambitious products that never ended up delivering anything. So maybe in another universe we could find out what would have happened. In this one, they didn't meet the goal, so that question didn't need to be answered. By the way, this was not the original price. Once things started slowing down, they decided to lower the price. The starting price was $830, a lot more in line with what you see with the iPhone, still cheaper for specs that are just way, way better, but at least they were more in line with that. They lowered the price down to $695 to hopefully speed up the donations and keep things rolling. It did speed things up, but it certainly wasn't enough. I think the best part of this whole situation is the explanation for why they weren't trying to be generally retail available. Under the In the Media section, we have what is Ubuntu Edge. In the car industry, Formula One provides a commercial testbed for cutting-edge technologies. The Ubuntu Edge project aims to do the same for the mobile phone industry, to provide a low-volume, high-technology platform crowd-funded by enthusiasts and mobile computing professionals, a pioneering project that accelerates the adoption of new technologies and drives them down into the mainstream. This beautifully crafted smartphone, which has a random space at the start of this section, is a proving ground for the most advanced mobile technologies on the horizon, a showpiece for true mobile innovation, and at the heart of it all is convergence. Connect to any monitor, and this Ubuntu phone transforms into an Ubuntu PC with a fully integrated desktop OS and shared access to all files. Now, the place that this metaphor falls apart here is Formula One is more expensive than regular retail cars. You're not spending $50,000 on a Formula One car. You're spending millions to do that. But you can buy it for $695 apparently. Actually, I lied about the best part. The best part is one of the tiers. So going from $695, the next tier up is the Enterprise Starter Pack at $7,000. This comes with 10 Ubuntu Edge smartphones. That's great. The bad part about it, though, is whilst you get free shipping in the US and UK, you have to pay $50 for all the other locations. I just spent $7,000. Surely you can pay the shipping bill to make that happen. Whilst the campaign was going on, there was a lot of positive coverage from the tech media about how Canonical is going to change the mobile world, how they're going to create a whole new market SKU here. They're going to go to war with Apple and Samsung and create a new way to use a phone. But the instant the campaign ended and it didn't become successful, articles like this started coming out. Ubuntu Edge, failure was inevitable. The idea of raising $32 million through crowdfunding was always, how shall I put this, quite a bold idea. Whilst the idea of the Ubuntu Edge hardware device might have failed, the idea of Ubuntu on mobile with Ubuntu Touch, whilst Linux phones are still a very, very niche thing, that is a real thing that you actually can go and use. And a few short years later, after the Ubuntu Edge campaign, there was another attempt at doing an Ubuntu phone. This time not being a whole new device that they are making in-house, this time basically just being a rebrand in a similar way to things like the Dell XPS Developer Edition or things that Lenovo are doing. The first device is the Aquarius E4.5 Ubuntu Edition, and the second one was the Aquarius E5 HD Ubuntu Edition, which are terrible names. I don't know what 4.5 and HD are supposed to mean in this context, but these are devices that did exist. They were both released in 2015, and they were far more down-to-earth devices that actually made sense to produce at the time. They were both sitting in the under $250 bracket, with specs to obviously match that range. Now, the Ubuntu Edge campaign was a massively ambitious project, some might argue overly ambitious, that tried to drive a wedge in the phone industry. And if it had succeeded, there is a possibility that Linux phones actually would be a legitimate device class that exists today. If they had done a smaller campaign and tried to make something generally retail available, I have a feeling things would have went very, very differently, because clearly people were excited. They were 12.7 million excited though, not 32 million. But what do you think? Have you ever used a Linux phone? Were you around back when the Ubuntu Edge was being discussed and they were trying to fund it? If you were there, were you one of the people that tried to fund the device? I would really like to know, and I would like to know what you thought about the specs of the time. Did you think they were a little bit more than they really could have been? I'd like to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, and LiberaPay linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and if you join the Patreon, I won't give you a phone, but at least you'll get your name here.